Okay, in this video, I want to walk through the Excel applications for the cost-benefit analysis. Before doing that, let's finish up the notes for the cost-benefit analysis. I don't want to just read the notes to you. You can do that yourself. So what I want to do is we'll look through them. Hopefully, you've read the notes before you've looked at this video. I highly recommend that so that you know the details. And then I want to highlight a couple of areas. First, those areas that are very important for you to be aware of from a job opportunity standpoint, what you would be doing in a job or what you want to be aware of as you do a job related to cost benefit. It is one of the most important functions you see for any business major, not just finance or accounting, but any major. So we'll walk through the notes from that standpoint. I also want to emphasize a few things that would be important for your particular team project, cost benefit analysis project. So with that in mind, rather than just reading the notes to you, let's start in the notes on page 29, and let me just highlight the areas that are at a high level, starting with how some firms organize projects. You can see many firms break capital projects into categories. The reason they do that is to streamline the decision-making process. When you have projects coming in, some need to go through a very detailed, elaborate analysis. Others need to be speeded up because there's an urgency to get them done as quickly as possible. For example, projects may be defined as required. That is, the law requires it, regulation requires it. They need to be done. There's no reason to spend a lot of time deciding whether to do the project or not. The question is how to do it most efficiently. Some projects are classified as cost savings. These are firms' most favorite projects. Many of the projects that you're doing in your team competition are cost savings projects, such as the decision between buying a car or using shared services, or decision about using solar panels to reduce your energy costs in your house. Those are cost savings projects. Some projects are customer service. It might be a new website, or some new service or offering that you're providing to improve customer service and hopefully increase revenues, or at least retaining your existing customers. And then big projects, those that have very elaborate review, probably the review and the analysis will go on for months, and those are expansion and diversification projects where a firm is moving into a new market, either with an existing product are creating new products for existing or new markets, especially if they're buying another firm or selling off a product. Those type of projects, those are major, and they require very extensive analysis. None of your projects really fit in those last three categories. Most of your projects fit in the cost savings analysis. We are going to work on the Excel applications here pretty quickly, and you have some YouTubes on that, and then this YouTube today will be valuable as well. Let's real quickly just review what we did. So we learned cost benefit analysis by just doing one. We did the cash handling project where we converted checks to electronic, and we used net present value, internal rate of return, and discounted payback as our three criteria. Let's step back and make sure we just understand those three. Net present value is probably the most important one. It's what the textbook says is the most important one. And essentially what you're doing is you're taking each cash flow and discounting it back to the present, just like we did when we were doing time value of money. You're taking the cash flow and dividing it by 1 plus the discount rate raised at the time. And you take the sum of all those future benefits in a present value, you subtract the cost of the project. And so here the accept reject rule, as we saw in the Excel, is you accept projects whose net present value is greater than 0. You reject projects whose net present value is less than 0. If you're greater than 0, when the net present value is greater than 0, then you are increasing the value of the firm when you do the project, assuming all of your assumptions are correct. The net present value is very good because the discount rate we're using is essentially a hurdle rate. It tells us what other opportunities the firm might have, and so if this project does better than that hurdle rate, if we can make more than our cost of capital, then that tells us we're doing better than our other alternatives are if our project has a higher net present value than another project, we know that it's going to add more value than another project. The discount rate incorporates risk. Some textbooks, in fact, most textbooks from cost benefit analysis say that you should select a discount rate that's unique to each project. I doubt many firms do that except in those very major projects, those expansion and diversification projects. For most projects, I know where I worked, all projects simply use the firm's weighted average cost of capital, which we'll talk about later in the class. It's very difficult to have every project come up with its own specific discount rate. It's just very subjective and it's very clumsy, and project managers could try to argue for a lower discount rate so their project's more likely to be approved. It's just too much politics involved. So what I recommend for risk is use the firm's weighted average cost of capital unless it's one of those very major projects that need more extensive analysis, and then cover risk just the way we're doing in our class, which is by running sensitivity analysis. A best case, a worst case, and a base case. I think that's a better way to address risk with most projects. And then net present value does a good job of adjusting for the timing of cash flows. Cash flows that you get in the first year, all else equal, would be more valuable than projects you get in the third or fourth year just because of the time value of money. Now, with net present value, you have a few issues to think about. One is if you have projects that are mutually exclusive, if you do one, but you can't do the others, so choosing project A means you can't do project B, then which of those do you choose? And the simple answer is you choose the one with the higher net present value, assuming that the projects have comparable sizes and comparable time periods. They both cost, say, maybe about $1 million, and they both last about 5 years. Then it's very simple, just pick the project with a higher net present value. If one project lasts 3 years and another project lasts 9 years, it becomes more complicated then, and we're not going to get into that, but there are ways to try to address that, because obviously a project only lasts 3 years. You invest in that project, it gives you the return, and then you can do another project in year 4. If the project's 9 years, you have to invest in that project and you can't do anything until the 9 years are up as you're waiting for that project to pay you back. So it's, if the two projects are comparable, pick the project with the higher net present value. If the time periods and the initial investments are different, then it gets a little more complicated. We'll address when the project sizes are different. That's when the profitability index will work, and we'll talk about that. In fact, it comes under the caption of capital rationing. So capital rationing, as you can see in the notes, is when firms can't invest in every single project that's positive net present value. They have to decide. And so how do you decide? How do you decide if you have 10 projects that have a positive net present value, but you only have enough money to do 3? How do you pick them? Well, you could pick the one with the highest net present value, but it might also be the most expensive one. It might cost you $6 million, where other projects only cost you $500,000 or $1 million. So if you do the $6 million project, it eliminates your ability to do several other projects. So it really is not just the highest net present value of each project, but it's the combination of projects such that you use up your entire capital budgeting, your funds for capital budgeting, such that the combination of projects, once you use all of your budget, gives you the highest net present value. The profitability index is one way you can try to rank projects, and what it does is it takes the present value of those benefits and divides it by the initial cost. And the ratio, if the net present value is greater than 0, that ratio will be greater than 1 because your present value benefits is greater than the cost. So the profitability index is a simple way of saying just rank projects based on their profitability index. And that way, the projects that have the most bang for the buck, the best return versus initial cost, they're the ones you prioritize. That may not give you the best optimal answer for your firm. The best thing to do is look at every combination of projects to decide. But if you need a quick and easy way to rank projects, the profitability index will probably give you a better answer than other approaches. The problem with all of these is that the finance texts assume that these projects all show up on the same day, one day a year, and the firm just decides between all of those projects. But in reality, new projects, new opportunities show up all the time throughout the year, so it's a very messy project. So we won't get into these other issues. They're quite complex. If you're doing this in your career, if you're responsible capital budgeting, I would recommend read many articles on this. It is quite a complex, far more complex topic than most textbooks acknowledge. And you want to do it in a way that is going to best increase the value of your firm, but not so complicated that you just can't execute it. No one can understand what you're doing. All right, so that's net present value. For our purposes, for your project, you simply want to figure out if your project has a positive net present value, and if it does, then that will answer that question. You can accept the project. The second criteria we will look at to decide whether we want to do a project or not is the discounted payback period. We saw that in the video I did for the last class, and we walked through that. It's somewhat of a complicated calculation, but Excel makes it a lot easier. Once you have it set up, it's very easy to use for other templates, for other projects. But essentially here, the argument is projects that pay back faster are more valuable than projects that take a longer period of time, especially as fast as technology is changing. And so we have a preference for shorter paybacks, and some firms will even have a select cutoff period. They say we only accept projects that have a payback, say maybe 4 years or less. For your projects, this is very important. For your team projects, I do not need you to pick a cutoff period. I do not need you to have a standard to say we only accept projects that are 10 years or less. What I want you to do is calculate the discounted payback period for your project and use that as part of your analysis. So if you're doing, do I buy a car or use rideshare? Since a car lasts about 5, 6, 7 years, then if your payback is 12 years, then you say, wow, buying a car doesn't make sense because it's going to take me 12 years to pay back buying that car versus using rideshare, and I don't think my car will last 12 years. If the payback is 2 years, you can say, wow, buying a car is much better than using shared ride because my car will last probably much more than 2 years, but that's the payback. So you just use it as part of your analysis. What I happen to state what your cutoff period is. The solar panel project will probably have a payback period that's well over 20 years, potentially, or at least definitely over 10 years. And in that case, you just want to know what it is so you can tell the person making the decision how long that payback is, just in case they want to compare that with the expected useful life. What I recommend in the notes, and you saw that, is combining net present value with the discounted payback and try to meet both criteria. Unless it's a very major strategic project that you know will take many years, and in that case you provide an exception to the payback rule. The next area of criteria we used to pick projects was the internal rate of return. We saw in Excel how Excel builds that for you. So the internal rate of return, very important to understand. In our project that we did with the cash handling, we used a discount rate of 7% as our cost of capital. The internal rate of return is the discount rate that if you used it would give you a net present value of exactly 0. And so, if you remember in the cash handling, our discount rate was 7% and the internal rate of return was 24%. So the rule here is if your internal rate of return is greater than your cost of capital, or that hurdle rate, 24% versus 7% in our cash handling example, then you accept the project. The rest of the notes, you can read through them. These are important to understand that internal rate of return and net present value, they do have some issues. Net present value is the more pure and more reliable of the two to use. Most textbooks would say net present value, always use it and throw out internal rate of return or use it as a secondary tool. I do agree net present value is a better tool than internal rate of return because of the reinvestment rate assumption. The NPV rule assumes any cash flows are reinvested at the firm's cost of capital, whereas the internal rate of return rule assumes any cash you received, any benefits received are reinvested at the internal rate of return, which is for a project we were looking at with a 24% internal rate of return, assuming you reinvest at 24% is probably not a good assumption. One area that both internal rate of return and net present value struggle with is when a project has a negative cash flow in the future. I don't want to get into that too much detail, but that does create issues for both net present value and internal rate of return. If we have time later in the class, this is one of those issues we might come back to, so I can show you how I would handle that situation. Textbooks say this is only an issue for internal rate of return, but if we have time in class, I'll show you why I believe it's an issue for both of these. So what I would recommend is you ever have a project where there's a negative cash flow in the future, there are some special things you need to do to adjust for that. A good example might be a nuclear power plant. That plant might last 50 years, and at the end of 50 years, they have to decommission the plant, which is very, very expensive, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. That's a future negative cash flow. How you put that in the project, how you discount that cash flow, there's a lot of important ramifications of that that you would want to take in consideration. You can read the notes on how I did that. All right, so that gets you through the criteria. What I want to do in the next video is talk about forecasting, and we'll get into that and some special issues there, especially related to your project. So I'll stop it there to keep these videos about 15 minutes in length.